How do you conduct an armoured invasion of a country when your tanks are outnumbered 1.7 to 1 and most of your tanks are inferior models? We look at the Battle of France, 1940. Ladies and gentlemen, the Battle of France. This is the start of a significant podcast series. I really want to delve into the counterattack at Arras, but to really do that justice, we're going to have to look at a wide range of peripheral topics to really understand what happened there. I would like to thank Lieutenant Colonel Robin Davies and Major Paul Knight from the British Army's LWC Lessons Exploitation Centre for greatly assisting in the research and putting together the materials for this podcast series. Paul reached out to me and asked if I would be interested in developing a series about the Battle of France in support of a battlefield study tour that they are looking to conduct. And to be honest, my understanding of the Battle of France was actually quite limited, and much of it was what I would call the popular historic, effectively fiction about the German Blitzkrieg as it was conducted. The Arras counterattack was something that I was only vaguely aware of, and I had no idea of the strategic implications for that battle. But the more I read into it, the more fascinating the story became, and more importantly, important lessons for the conduct of operations in a contemporary environment. Some of the areas that we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at are the expansion of the British Army. The Military Training Act had been passed in May of 1939, and that saw single men aged between 20 and 22 being required to undertake 6 months of military training, and 240,000 registered for service. On the day that Britain declared war on Germany, the 3rd of September 1939, Parliament immediately passed a more wide-reaching measure, and that was the National Service Armed Forces Act, and it imposed conscription on all males aged between 18 and 41. Conscription, though, whilst significantly increasing the manpower available for the defence of the nation, brings with it significant problems. How is the equipment going to be sourced? How are the troops going to be trained in that equipment? How do you manage with the dilution of officers, NCOs and senior NCOs as the number of companies, brigades, divisions increases dramatically? We're going to look at the impact of the civilian and political spheres on the military preparations. What were the difficulties encountered, particularly in the British Army, as it was making that transition from a peacetime army onto an operational footing? That mobilisation will lead us then into the phony war. Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, and 2 days later the UK and France declared war on Germany. There was a period of 8 months until the 10th of May where there was very little action. So we're going to look at how Germany, France and Britain spent those critical 8 months. We'll discuss some of the difficulties of coalition warfighting, especially from the point of view of the UK, and especially from the point of view of how you manage the coalition when your coalition partner's civilian government and high command is disintegrating. Aerial warfare is an area where there has been significant technical advances since the First World War. It will be interesting to look at the differences in the employment of air power between the French, the British, and the Germans, because they all had significantly different thinking behind the employment of air power. A great example of this is the use of strategic bombing during the phony war by the British. Instead of attacking targets like airfields and troop concentrations, they were conducting what was at the time referred to as pamphlet raids or the confetti war. They were dropping pamphlets on the German population, trying to undermine the German moral centre of gravity. We're going to have a look at the Arras counterattack, and we're going to have a look at some of the other actions by the British Army and the French where they were able to fight really, really well. But we want to look into why they weren't effective at the operational level. An area that we're going to spend quite a bit of time on is the myths that have developed around the German breakthrough in the Ardennes. We'll look at the development of Blitzkrieg Doctrine, because this is a fascinating story and there's a lot of really good lessons that we can learn about contemporary operations. But also we want to have a look at the moral or the psychological element of how the Blitzkrieg worked against troops in the field and against the high command of the adversaries. So we're going to discuss the national strategic, military strategic, operational and tactical elements that fell out of the development for Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow, which was the plan for the invasion of France, the development of the plan for the Sichelschnitt, which is the sickle cut, and where the Germans developed their Schwerpunkt, where they decided to employ it and why, and how effective it was. We don't often talk about weapons on the Principles of War podcast, but this is an area that I'm actually keen to delve into in a little bit more detail because there was a significant disparity between many of the vehicles, particularly in the tanks. Tanks are always a compromise between maneuver, protection, and firepower, but there's some other considerations that are really important. These considerations can make a huge difference to how effective the tanks are on the ground and in contact. Before we start looking at the German doctrine and its development, what we might do is quickly look at some of our doctrine, so that gives us a reference point with which we can look back on. The armoured thrust through the Ardennes was very much an example of the Manoeuvrist approach. So we're going to look at how we got to that Manoeuvrist approach because it's a very, very interesting story. But what do we know from our doctrine? So LWD1, the Australian doctrine, states that the Manoeuvrist approach seeks to shatter the enemy's cohesion through a series of actions orchestrated to a single purpose, creating a turbulent and rapidly deteriorating situation with which the enemy cannot cope. The Manoeuvrist approach focuses commanders at every level on exploiting enemy weaknesses, avoiding enemy strengths, and protecting friendly vulnerabilities. At all times, the commander is seeking to undermine the enemy's centre of gravity. There are 4 tenets for manoeuvre, and they are, the first one, most importantly, focus of all actions on the centre of gravity. Second, combined arms teams. Third is orchestration. And fourth is mission command. The centre of gravity being that characteristic capability or locality from which a force, nation or alliance derives its freedom of action, strength or will to fight. At the tactical level, the centre of gravity will often change as the mission progresses and will frequently be determined by the interaction of enemy and friendly intentions. The approaches to defeating the enemy's centre of gravity are described as dislocation, disruption and destruction. The British doctrine, as detailed in Land Operations, has an entire chapter on the Manoeuvrist approach, and it states that the Manoeuvrist approach is the Army's fighting doctrine for the tactical level. It determines the way we fight enemies across the different types of operation, and because fighting can have extremely significant consequences, it is set in the broader context of the audience and integrated action. It is an indirect approach which emphasises effects on the will of the enemy. It blends lethal and non-lethal actions to achieve objectives which shape the enemy's understanding, undermines their will, and break their cohesion. It aims to apply strength against vulnerabilities. Significant features are momentum, tempo, and agility, which in combination lead to shock and surprise. It entails doing the unexpected, using initiative, and seeking originality, combined with a relentless determination to succeed. Enabled by mission command, the Manoeuvrist approach has 2 specific requirements: an attitude of mind and understanding of the enemy's vulnerabilities. It requires an attitude of mind that seeks indirect solutions to reduce the enemy's will to fight by pitching our strength against enemy vulnerability rather than strength. This indirect approach emphasises the use of initiative to act in original ways unexpected by the enemy and a relentless determination to retain the initiative and exploit success. It does not preclude destruction of the enemy so long as the results sought are disproportionately greater than the resources applied and the enemy's will to fight is undermined and their cohesion shattered. It depends on practical knowledge, agility, mission command, and the willingness to accept risks. The second requirement is an understanding of the enemy's vulnerabilities, both before contact and as they appear and evolve during battle. Centre of gravity analysis can be a useful tool for this. the manoeuvrist approach guides us to find, attack, and exploit these vulnerabilities in an enemy's strength. Additionally, commanders must consider carefully how the enemy themselves may apply the manoeuvrist approach. They must understand their own centre of gravity and critical vulnerabilities and protect their forces accordingly. Contextual understanding is also necessary. The manoeuvrist approach is not executed in isolation from wider contextual and operational factors, for example, domestic appetite for risk and casualties of friendly and enemy forces, or second and third order effects of actions taken. I just want to pause here and have a quick discussion about the understanding of the enemy's vulnerabilities and how centre of gravity analysis can be a useful tool. When we look at the Battle of France and when we look at the German order of battle and their plan, it's really quite clear that Panzer Group Kleist is the centre of gravity. It is heavily weighted with the Schnelltruppen, which is the fast troops, the majority of which is armoured. There are some motorised infantry units. And in fact, the only other armoured troops are in the 4th Army, von Kluge's, and that's the 3rd Panzer Corps under Hoth, and that's made up of 5th and 7th Division. 7th Division is Rommel's division. So they're on the right-hand flank of Panzer Group Kleist, and they'll be protecting their flank. So effectively, all of the mechanised troops. So this is great. We've determined that the centre of gravity is Panzer Group Kleist. Then we can work out the critical vulnerabilities, and they are going to be your typical ones. So they're going to need some good terrain to be able to manoeuvre in. They're also going to need a significant amount of logistics. And the further they move, the quicker they move, the harder it is going to be for that logistic support to be able to keep up. So anything that we can do to interdict the logistic support is going to fundamentally undermine the capability of Panzer Group Kleist. We can deny them bridges, we can physically dislocate them from their fuel supplies and ammunition resupply. But there's one problem with this analysis, and this is the fact that we are looking back with the benefit of hindsight, significant hindsight. We're looking back at a battle that occurred 80 years ago. And the analysis comes from not only reading the stories from the British point of view and from the French point of view, but I'm also reading it from the German point of view. A lot of this has been written by the generals who actually built this plan and who fought the battle. They had recently invaded Poland. What can we learn from that? Unfortunately, not a lot. The employment of mechanised forces in general, and armour in particular, was fundamentally different in the invasion of Poland. We won't go into too much detail about the invasion of Poland, but it was very much a traditional, for those times, attack, in that it was led by the infantry with armoured vehicles in support. So if you're General Maurice Gamelin and you're contemplating which course of action you're thinking about to defeat the German army that sits across the border, the information that you've got about the invasion of Poland, which, let's remember, there wouldn't have been a lessons learnt process that would have been widely disseminated out from the defeated Polish army. There may not have been observers who were able to get out. That information would not have been helpful, and in fact, it potentially reinforced the understanding of what you were expecting, rather than hinting at the fact that there was going to be a different approach that you would be facing. In the description of the second requirement for understanding, it does warn us. Additionally, commanders must consider carefully how the enemy themselves might apply the manoeuvrist approach. Bearing that warning in mind, we go back to the first requirement, and that is the attitude of mind. The indirect approach emphasises the use of initiative to act in original ways unexpected by the enemy and a relentless determination to retain the initiative and exploit success. The problem set that the German army had was fundamentally different when they considered invading France as opposed to the invasion of Poland. Before we leave off our contemporary doctrine review, there's a couple of interesting paragraphs in the British Doctrine. The first one discusses the psychological impact of the manoeuvrist approach. The tools of seizing the initiative, shaping understanding, and attacking will and cohesion are means to an end. By holding the initiative and operating at higher tempo than the enemy, we aim to impose multiple simultaneous dilemmas, forcing the enemy to make decisions favourable to us or, when necessary, to induce shock and so render the enemy incapable of rational decision making. The classic physiological and psychological symptoms of shock are numbness and irrational behaviour, preventing the enemy from responding effectively to a developing situation. It is most debilitating when the full range of the force's capabilities, lethal and non-lethal, is applied against enemy vulnerabilities. As an effect, shock is both unpredictable and temporary, so its effects must be rapidly exploited before the enemy can respond effectively. As we look at the response of, in particular, the French High Command, we will see the psychological impact of the manoeuvrist approach. And this is one of the really big questions for the Battle of France. What was it in the French High Command that led to their inability to respond? Was it a lack of flexibility in their thinking, a lack of flexibility in their doctrine? Had they planned to fight the wrong war? Their troops, given the right circumstances, were able to fight really well. This was more of a high command issue in a lot of respects. The doctrine goes on to describe the way that we seize and hold the initiative. The initiative is the ability to dictate the course of events, to decide and act before our opponents do, and so gain advantage. In contact with the enemy, gaining, regaining, and retaining the initiative requires tempo, surprise, preemption, momentum, simultaneity, exploitation, and avoiding culmination. They cannot be applied in isolation, but are mutually reinforcing. Tempo is the rate of activity of operations relative to the enemy's. It is about acting more quickly than the enemy. The side which consistently decides and acts fastest should gain and hold an advantage. Speed and quality of decision making, while necessary to gain and hold the initiative, is not sufficient. Action must flow swiftly, enabled by mission command and good battle procedure. Often a perfect plan made and executed too late will fail, whereas an imperfect one made before an enemy can act will succeed. So that's a nice little nod to General Patton and his quote about executing good plans with maximum violence. There were a couple of things that the German army did at the psychological level and the physiological level that enabled them to generate a tempo significantly faster than the French. The decisive event in the campaign plan for the Wehrmacht was the seizing of the bridges on the Meuse River. Every soldier understood the importance of the mission and the time criticality of it. It had been drilled into them repeatedly that every minute counted in the race to get to the Meuse River. Morale was high. They were well indoctrinated into the importance of getting there as quickly as possible, but that wasn't going to be enough. Particularly when you think that what was being asked of them was actually quite difficult for them to deliver. Heinz Guderian issued this order to his soldiers. I demand that you go sleepless for at least 3 nights if that should be necessary. That's 72 hours. That's quite an extended period of time to go without sleep. What's even more astonishing is that they were able to achieve this. How did they do that? Well, if we look at the reports from the supply officer for the 1st Panzer Division. So 1st Panzer Division, the best of the best. Of the 157 divisions involved in the invasion, the 1st Division was considered to be the best. It had the best equipment, and it was assigned the best location on the line of departure to enable it to get to Sedan and to effect the crossing of the Meuse River. They were described as being at the point of the main effort itself. Their mission was incredibly important. That supply officer, Graf von Kielmansegg, one of the things that he needed to take was 20,000 tablets of Pervitin. Pervitin, that's the trade name of a drug that was manufactured by a pharmaceutical company called Temla. It's actually methamphetamine. This was one of the ways that the Wehrmacht was able to get their soldiers to generate that tempo. Now, how successful was it? Well, probably not very successful, because they significantly decreased the availability of Pervitin in 1940. It was limited by requiring a doctor's prescription, soldiers were only given a couple at a time, and they were discouraged from using it during combat because of the side effects, which included violence and led to war crimes or attacking their own officers. So, back to seizing and holding the initiative. Next component, surprise. It must be central to the design of all combat operations and be sought by commanders at all levels. Surprise is a potent psychological weapon, causing shock through unexpected action in time, space, and method. For example, surprise can be achieved by attacking an enemy earlier or more rapidly than anticipated, including through cyber electromagnetic activities, time, attacking at the enemy's rear, or preparing well-concealed depth forces, space, unforeseen employment of air manoeuvre or indigenous forces, the concealment and employment of reserves, or sudden withdrawal to defensive positions, method. The increasing visibility of a land force's action places increased importance on the use of deception to achieve surprise and to protect the force's own vulnerabilities. Deception is defined as those measures designed to mislead the enemy by manipulation, distortion, or falsification of evidence to induce them to react in a manner prejudicial to their interests. There are two methods of deception: simulation, which deliberately allows an enemy to see false activity, for example through a demonstration, and dissimulation, which is hiding the reality by concealing it or making it appear to be something else. Deception plans must have a clearly defined aim, be convincing by playing to enemies' perceptions, prejudices, and likely reactions, and be flexible without consuming disproportionate resources or time. Enemies will also employ deception, requiring commanders and staff to have a skeptical mindset. The acme of surprise is when it combines high-tempo physical manoeuvre, superiority in the virtual domain, and concentrated application of violence, sometimes termed shock action. Enabled by security, surprise involves using combinations of secrecy, concealment, deception, originality, audacity, and tempo to confuse, paralyze, or disrupt effective decision-making and undermine an adversary's morale. Thus, it is instrumental not only to gaining the initiative, but also subsequently to attacking and defeating the enemy. It need not be total, but merely sufficient to instill doubt, delaying a decision or an action until it is too late. The effects of surprise are transitory, as shock and confusion recede over time, so its effects should be exploited rapidly and aggressively. There's a few things to unpack in regard to surprise with the German attack. Firstly, Army Group B in the north attacks first. This attack is reinforced with multiple air-mobile assaults. The Germans conducted airborne landing operations in northern Belgium and Holland, with missions against Eben-Emael, the Albert Canal bridges, and airfields near The Hague and the bridges of Rotterdam. This reinforced the conception within the Allied headquarters that Army Group B was the main effort. This is what they were expecting, and this is what they were seeing. The Allies were expecting a replay of the Schlieffen Plan, and the German deception plan reinforced that expectation. The surprise was then delivered with the attack through the Ardennes forest, an area where there was a preconceived idea that it would be unsuitable for mechanised forces to move through. Not only that, the method of attack was dissimilar to what they were expecting. This was a mechanised lead assault. It was not supported by infantry, so it was moving a lot quicker. And that tempo delivers the shock action. And that sentence in the paragraph, enabled by security, surprise involves using combinations of secrecy, concealment, deception, originality, audacity, and tempo to confuse, paralyze, or disrupt effective decision-making, and to undermine the adversary's morale. That sentence could have been written specifically about this operation. The build-up of the army group was not well understood by the Allies, and even when it was discovered, the massive traffic jam, they weren't able to comprehend it because it was so different to what they were expecting to see. So excellent concealment before the move, before they cross the line of departure. The deception up in the north, particularly with the use of paratroops, which transfixed the gaze of the Allied headquarters in the north. Originality, this is a very different plan to what the Allies were expecting. And the originality comes from the risk that they're taking in moving through such constrained terrain. A highly risky move, that risk accepted in an incredibly audacious decision. And lastly, the tempo. Once they're through, then they're able to move at a speed with which the French High Command is unable to respond effectively. Next is preemption, which is to seize an opportunity, which may itself be fleeting, to deny the enemy an advantage before they act. It denies them the initiative and frustrates their plan. Its success lies in the speed with which the situation can be subsequently exploited. So in the Battle of France, was there any opportunity, however fleeting, to deny the enemy an advantage before they could act? The Wehrmacht was decisively engaged when it invaded Poland. There was nothing more than a light screen on the western frontiers, protecting the border between Germany and France. The opportunity, the fleeting opportunity, was for France to meet its treaty obligations to Poland and invade Germany. Now, this was in some respects about supporting Poland, but much more about seizing the initiative and taking advantage of the Wehrmacht whilst it was decisively engaged in Poland. The German invasion of Poland commenced on the 1st of September. The French had preemptively mobilised, partially on the 26th of August, and on the 1st of September full mobilisation was ordered. However, it wasn't until the 7th of September that the Saar Offensive was commenced. This was to have seen 40 divisions march into Germany. They advanced up to 8 kilometres, they captured 12 towns. All of this was unopposed. The French stopped short of the Siegfried Line, which was the German equivalent of the Maginot Line, and General Gamelin ordered on the 21st of September that French units to return back to behind the Maginot Line. What sort of opportunity to preempt German actions was it? Well, after the war, Alfred Jodl, who'd been Chief of Staff on the German Army High Command, said that if we did not collapse already in the year 1939, that was due only to the fact that during the Polish campaign, the approximately 110 French and British divisions in the West were held completely inactive against the 23 German divisions. And General Siegfried Westphal stated that if the French had attacked in full force in September 1939, that the German army could only have held out for 1 or 2 weeks. This half-hearted preemption antagonised Hitler, and he said that the enemy gains strength, and one winter night England and France will be on the Meuse without firing a shot and without our knowing about it. So on the 9th of October, he directed his 3 service chiefs to plan a preemptive offensive campaign on the northern flank of the Western Front through Luxembourg, Belgium and Holland. This offensive must be launched at the earliest moment in the greatest possible strength. It was issued 10 days later and revised 10 days after that. This was the original version of Fall Gelb, or Deployment Directive Case Yellow. We'll talk a little bit later about the iterations, because it was actually version 4 that was enacted. Momentum is the next factor. So momentum is the driving force of a moving object. Maintaining momentum keeps an enemy off balance and enables a commander to retain the initiative. As a product of velocity and mass, it is liable to be reduced through either loss of speed or of combat power, stalling the operation and so allowing the enemy to regain the initiative. Exploitation of momentum creates the bridges from seizing the initiative to achieving success. This is brilliantly illustrated by the Panzer Group drive to the coast. And we'll look at the impacts on C2, logistics, and morale over the course of this series. One key thing with this, though, is Hitler's halt order, which fundamentally destroyed the momentum that the Panzer Group had worked so hard to build up. And we'll look at why that halt order came into being and the impact of it, because that halt order had an impact that was significantly greater than the operational level. Simultaneity seeks to disrupt the decision-making process of opponents by confronting them with a number of concurrent problems. By attacking or threatening enemies in many ways and from many directions at once in a physical and virtual domains, they cannot concentrate on any one attack, nor establish priorities between them. They cannot choose how and where to react. They are torn between multiple threats and find it hard to respond coherently. Enemy cohesion is particularly susceptible when several layers of their command systems are acted against simultaneously. The German plan for battle takes simultaneity and builds on it with the right-left combination of Army Group B and C moving on the northern flank, doing exactly what the Allies expect them to do. They then enact their plans, which leaves them exposed for the move of Army Group A through the Ardennes forest. They then become torn between the multiple threats, and it is difficult for them to respond coherently. And this is why it takes so long for them to be able to mount a counterattack, which is quite ineffective and poorly coordinated at the level that they were hoping to be able to generate combat power. Exploitation is defined as taking full advantage of success in battle and following up initial gains. If not exploited, the effects of surprise and shock, preemption, tempo, momentum, and simultaneity are likely to be local and temporary. A capable enemy will try to recover and seek ways of regaining the initiative. Therefore, success should be exploited to maintain the initiative, extend and expand its effects, and encourage collapse. Exploitation can be planned or opportunistic. Planned exploitation is designed in advance to follow anticipated success and may require fresh echelon forces. Opportunistic exploitation is a way of building on local success. It should be carried out with the resources at hand and should be initiated as soon as an opportunity is recognised, particularly at lower tactical levels. The most effective exploitation integrates a full range of lethal and non-lethal capabilities available to the force, appropriate according to the task and environment. For example, a combat action may be exploited by manoeuvre and information activities, or, in a counterinsurgency context, by the combination of information activities and capacity building. Exploitation is enabled by mission command, effectively understanding and balanced mobile and flexible reserve or echelon forces, which can be deployed rapidly to take advantage of the opportunities presented. That paragraph explaining exploitation talks about it being enabled by mission command. It's really important to remember that mission command requires trust between subordinates and superiors. And even when you look at the German army in World War II, which is often seen as an exemplar for what mission command can be like, it's important to remember that there are friction points. And that would be, I think, a great example, the command crisis at Montcornet. Guderian had, up to this point, been consistently ignoring orders from superiors. He was given an order which he believed had been framed in a time that made it no longer relevant. So this is the OODA loop kind of problem that we see, where orders have been issued, they do not fit the current situation because the current situation has changed. So Guderian, as the true manoeuvrist, chooses to ignore those orders. He'd been given a halt line, however, his troops were well in advance of that halt line already, and he didn't see the point in stopping. When von Kleist found out about this, he ordered that the attack be halted immediately and that Guderian meet him at the airfield at Montcornet at 0700 the next morning. Von Kleist was described at the meeting as being furious. Didn't even greet Guderian, just launched into an attack about how he had ignored orders and had conducted the attack without authorization. Guderian wrote afterwards that when the first storm was past and he had stopped to draw a breath, I asked that I might be relieved of my command. Von Kleist was taken aback, and then he nodded and ordered me to hand over my command to the most senior general of my corps, and that was the end of our conversation. General List, who was the commander of the 12th Army, to which the Panzer Group had been subordinated, turned up in the afternoon at Guderian's headquarters, and he tried to calm things down and was directed by von Rundstedt to restore Guderian to his command. von Rundstedt obviously had a different mindset to von Kleist. This little example, which we'll probably delve into in a little bit more detail later, really highlights the difficulties in mission command, where you've got different personalities. And more importantly, different tolerances for risk acceptance. Guderian was well and truly out in front of the rest of the army. His flanks were horribly exposed, but he was trading all of that risk for the benefit of the development of the tempo and being able to get further into the rear of the French army's positions, which only increased the confusion and panic within the French high command. Last but not least, when it comes to seizing and retaining the initiative, we've got avoiding culmination. This is key and must be constantly balanced with the advantages presented by exploitation. The culminating point is defined as the point in time and the location at which a force no longer has the capability to continue an operation under current conditions and so loses the initiative. An operational pause may be required, a temporary and deliberate cessation of certain activities during the course of an operation to avoid reaching the culminating point and to be able to regenerate the combat power required to proceed with the next stage of the operation. Anticipation of when or where a force might be reaching a culminating point requires detailed understanding of the environment as well as of friendly and enemy forces. Implementation of an operational pause at a place and time to the advantage of friendly forces allows the initiative to be maintained. With the sickle cut, the further Guderian pushes towards the coast, the more tenuous that logistics link becomes. Avoiding culmination for the Panzers was even more difficult because this is the first time that they were being employed with this methodology. A lot of work had been done on the staff side to ensure that they would be able to sustain the force. One wonders what lessons the commander of 7th Panzer Division was able to take about avoiding culmination when he was promoted to the commander of the Deutsche Afrika Korps. So that was Erwin Rommel. We'll be looking at some of his actions during the Arras counterattack. But it is interesting to note that in the desert, in that perfect armoured terrain, was where Rommel pushed his forces to the point where they culminated and he was forced to retreat. We'll leave it there, and the next podcast in this series will be looking at the centre of gravity analysis for the Battle of France.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.